Amabel and the Cherries. Once upon a time there lived a little girl called Amabel, who was neither very pretty nor very clever, but who was nevertheless of a most generous and affectionate disposition, though she was so quiet and shy in her manner that no one gave her credit for either the feeling or the sense which she really possessed. This poor child was sadly slighted by both of her parents, who lavished all their tenderness on her younger sister Marion, a sprightly little creature of some 5 years old. Not that they ever treated Amabel with positive unkindness, but indifference from those she dearly loved in spite of their neglect was a severe trial to the sensitive heart of so loving a child. The little girl had always been sickly from her birth, and for this reason it was thought imprudent for her to eat of the many dainties in which Marion was permitted freely to indulge, and, being a very reasonable little thing, she would have readily understood this had it been explained to her. No one troubled themselves, however, about the matter, and many a tear did Amabel shed in consequence. One day, entering the dining room, she saw on the table a large basket filled with fine, ripe black-heart cherries, of which Marion was partaking with much enjoyment, seated on the knee of her mother, who selected the ripest and most tempting of the delicious fruit for her darling. Amabel sat down at a humble distance, modestly hoping that she might be invited to share in the feast, and she could scarcely restrain tears of mortification and disappointment, when Marion, having eaten to her heart's content, the remaining cherries were safely locked away in a large cupboard, the key of which her mother put into her pocket. All that day poor Amabel could not get the recollection of the cherries out of her mind, and at night, when she was lying in her little bed, her head kept running on the cherries, so that she found it impossible to sleep. She heard the clock strike the hours of 9, 10, and 11, and continued to toss and turn, as wide awake as ever. But as the last stroke of midnight sounded, a little voice called her by her name in so soft and sweet a tone that she was not frightened to look up. And there she saw, standing close beside her on her pillow, a charming little fairy, no larger than a bird, and much resembling one of those pretty creatures in appearance. Her dress was composed of different-coloured feathers. Her eyes sparkled like diamonds, and her tiny wings, which fluttered restlessly, gleamed with 1,000 changing hues. Then this pretty sprite danced gaily about on the pillow, clapping her hands and singing, "Little mortal, come with me to the fairy cherry tree, there with me to feast and play, till the night be turned to day. Ah, yes, I will go with you at once, you dear, kind, beautiful fairy," cried the delighted little Amabel, and sprang from her bed as she spoke. The fairy then touched her with her wand, and she found herself instantly as light as a feather, wings sprouted from her shoulders, and she was able to fly as easily as if she had indeed been a bird or a fairy. Out of the window flew the fairy, and after her went Amabel, and the pair never stopped flying till they had left the clouds behind them. Then Amabel found herself in a most beautiful orchard, such as could be seen nowhere, save in fairyland. Fruit trees of all descriptions were there in abundance, on which danced hundreds of tiny sprites, who seemed to be mightily enjoying themselves. Oranges, apples, pears, plums and figs bowed down the trees with their ripe clusters, and the clear moon shining over the branches made the leaves look like pure silver. In the midst of the orchard stood a magnificent tree laden with rich, ripe, black-heart cherries, which evidently belonged to Amabel's little fairy, who, perching on its branches, gaily invited her companion to eat as many cherries as she wished for. Never had Amabel passed so delightful a night. She and the fairy eat and laughed, and danced and sang in the cherry tree all night long. But when the daylight was at hand, the fairy said to Amabel, "Rosy streaks announce the dawn. Maiden, thou must now be gone. Farewell to me. Farewell to thee. Vanish from the cherry tree." And in the space of half a minute, Amabel found herself lying in her own little bed, in her own little chamber, which was now faintly illuminated by the first pale beams of the morning. She would, doubtless, have thought it all a dream, but when she arose and looked at herself in the glass, lo and behold, her mouth was deeply stained by such a black rim as nothing but an ample feast of black-heart cherries could have left. "What a fortunate thing that I have discovered this," thought Amabel, who forthwith commenced scrubbing her mouth as well as she could with soap and water. But, notwithstanding all her efforts, no washing would remove the stain of the cherries, and at the end of an hour she was forced to go down to her breakfast with the guilty mark upon her face and ready to sink with fear. "What can you have been doing to your mouth, Amabel?" was the general exclamation, as the unhappy little creature slunk into the room. "Ah, you have been eating the cherries from my cupboard?" cried her mother angrily. "I missed the key from my pocket when I rose this morning, and found it in the cupboard door. But I never suspected you of stealing, though I knew you to be both jealous and sullen." Indeed, mamma, I have not taken any cherries," began Amabel, but stopped in the midst of her speech, and blushed very deeply. In the meantime, her mother produced from the cupboard the basket which had contained the cherries, but which now was filled with nothing but cherry stones. This, together with the more than suspicious appearance of poor Amabel's face, determined her fate. She was locked up in her own room for a week, and had nothing to eat and drink but bread and water. And when she was once more permitted to mix with the family, the cold looks and constrained greeting of all around her were like daggers in the heart of the poor little girl, who felt that she was henceforth to be regarded in the light of a thief and a storyteller. Things went on thus till one unlucky day, when a delicious treat of freshly baked cakes, enjoyed by Marian, again awakened the longing of her less fortunate sister. When the cakes were locked away in the cupboard, Amabel followed them with her eyes, and during all the day she could think of nothing else. At night she could not rest, and while tossing sleeplessly on her pillow, the hour of midnight struck from the neighbouring church clock. As the last sound died away, a little voice by Amabel's bedside called, "Amabel! Amabel!" She started up and opened her eyes with astonishment at seeing a pretty little man, a span high, with a cotton nightcap on his head and a white apron before him. There was no mistaking that he was a fairy baker, even if the flowery state of his tiny hands and arms had not served to confirm this idea. Dancing about in high glee, the little baker sang these words: "To the fairies' bakehouse come, cakes to eat, both seed and plum, almond cakes and ginger too. We will bake all night for you. Little mortal, feast away, till the night be turned to day." "Oh, pray take me with you at once, dear little baker," cried Amabel, and the little fellow, taking her hand, stamped with his foot upon the floor, which immediately opened beneath them, and they both sank several fathoms deep in the earth. When Amabel had sufficiently recovered from the surprise of her journey to look about her, she perceived that she was in a large bake-house, completely filled by busy little bakers, who were baking the most delicious cakes that can be imagined. Some kneaded the dough, others prepared the currants, sweetmeats and spices, and others were constantly taking from the oven newly baked batches of these tempting dainties, of which Amabel's conductor, who was evidently the chief of the bakers, from the way in which he ordered all the rest about, pressed her to eat to her heart's content. Thus the night passed in the most agreeable manner possible, but when day was at hand, the fairy said to Amabel, "Day is come, work is done, little maiden, hasten home." And in a trice, Amabel was lying snugly in her little bed, for all the world as if she had been there all night. But when she rose, there were crumbs sticking to her mouth which neither rubbing nor scrubbing would remove. So at last, she was forced to abandon the attempt and go down to breakfast in a terrible fright. As soon as she appeared, she saw her mother standing by the door of the open cupboard, holding in her hand the dish which had yesterday been full of cakes, but which now was empty, save for a few crumbs. In spite of Amabel's tears and protestations, she was not believed. "The wicked child," said her mother, "will persist in her falsehoods, when the very crumbs from her feast remain upon her face to prove her guilt." The poor child, therefore, now fared worse than ever. The preference formerly shown to Marian was now quite undisguised, and Amabel sometimes had a hard struggle to prevent herself from showing, in her behaviour to her little sister, the bitterness which continued injustice could not fail to engender in her childish heart. But she did struggle with all her generous and affectionate soul, and bore her trial meekly and bravely too. Some time after this, a large box of sweetmeats was sent as a present to Amabel and Marian from a kind uncle. Amabel had been ailing for some days, and for that reason no sweetmeats were given to her, though Marian, as usual, was permitted to enjoy the treat, which was denied to her suffering sister. When the box was locked away in the large cupboard, however, Amabel steadfastly turned away her eyes, and would not permit a single wish for the sweetmeats to disturb her. And when she lay in her little bed that night, she said her prayers calmly and peacefully, and was soon sleeping, the happy slumber of the innocent and good. As the clock struck 12, she was aroused by the sound of her own name, uttered in a sweet small voice, such as she had heard twice before, and opening her eyes, she saw a tiny creature, formed of barley sugar, jumping about on her pillow and singing, "Come with me to the sugar-cane isle, and dwell with the sweetmeat sprites awhile. Sugar plums drop from the loaded trees, citron and orange peel scent the breeze. Haste then to sugar-cane isle away, and feast till the night be turned to day." As he jumped about in the joy of his heart, a golden light played through his transparent form, and he looked so tempting and delicious that it was difficult for Amabel to restrain her desire of catching him up and eating him at a mouthful. She therefore closed her eyes, and would not look at him again. So after a while, the little creature took himself off in a huff, and Amabel shed a few quiet tears for the delights she had lost in refusing to accompany him to Sugar-cane Isle. The church clock soon after struck 1, and behold, the cherry-tree fairy appeared by Amabel's bedside, and sang, "Little maiden, come with me to the fairy cherry-tree, there with me to feast and play, till the night be turned to day." But Amabel shook her head and said to the pretty sprite, "Nay, little fairy, I may not visit the cherry-tree tonight." And though the fairy touched her with her tiny hand, and did all that she could to persuade her, she remained firm in her determination, and the cherry-tree fairy vanished at last in a pet, without her playfellow. The clock now struck 2, and in the same instant the fairy baker stood by Amabel, capering about and singing, "To the fairy's bakehouse come, cakes to eat, both seed and plum. Almond cakes and ginger too, we will bake all night for you. Little maiden, with us stay, till the night be turned to day." But the good child turned as deaf an ear to the baker as she had done to the others, and after a while he bustled off in a very angry and disconsolate state at the ill success of his endeavours. The clock now struck 3, and all at once so splendid a radiance illumined the little chamber that it surpassed the light of noonday. And Amabel, on opening her eyes, found the room quite full of sprites, singing and rejoicing like little birds in springtime. Cherry-tree fairies, baker fairies, and sweetmeat fairies were there in multitudes, but by the bedside stood a fairy of resplendent beauty, taller by a full inch than her companions, and of so lively and majestic an appearance that Amabel knew her at once to be no other than the fairy queen herself. She therefore sprang from her bed, and acknowledged the honour of this royal visit by kneeling at the feet of her illustrious guest. The fairy queen smiled kindly and graciously upon her, and then sang as follows in a voice resembling that of a bird of paradise. "Fly with me, maiden of mortal mould, to my bowers of light and my halls of gold. Such blossoms of beauty there thou'lt see, as beseem a royal gift to thee. Haste, dearest maiden, and fear not me." Glancing upward at the lovely queen, and reading in her mild and serene aspect the encouragement of feeling that she should be doing no wrong, Amabel declared her readiness to accompany her majesty, and a blue and silver chariot, drawn by 12 milk-white doves, appeared instantly through the window, which opened by its own accord to admit it. The fairy queen seated herself in this charming equipage, and motioned Amabel to take the place by her side. And as quick as thought, the doves flew through the air with them, accompanied by the whole of the fairy court. On they went with the speed of the wind, leaving the clouds behind them, till the chariot stopped before a palace of pure gold, surrounded by gardens of such enchanting beauty as mortal eye never before beheld. Alighting from her chariot, the fairy queen then entered the palace, leading Amabel by the hand, and conducted her to a magnificent banquet hall formed of pearls and emeralds, where they found a sumptuous repast awaiting them, their entertainment being completed by a melodious concert from the attendant fairies, who sang their sweetest songs to add to the pleasure of their beloved queen and her mortal friend. The banquet being at an end, the Queen conducted Amabel into the gardens of the palace, where flowers of all descriptions were blooming in great beauty and profusion, and after passing through such scenes of loveliness as I want words to express, they stopped before a parterre of exquisite blossoms, around the slender stems of which hung golden labels, each of which bore an inscription describing the peculiar virtues of the flower it adorned. On the rose was written beauty, on the lily purity, on the geranium riches, on the azalea rank, and on the tulip wit. But peeping through its dark green leaves, Amabel spied a lovely violet, on which was written, "Who chooseth me, beloved will be." The Queen then told her that she was free to choose any one of the flowers for her own, and Amabel pondered for a little space. I should like to be very beautiful, thought she, and rich and noble and witty, but all these might not win for me the love of my dear parents, and one fond kiss from their lips would be dearer to me than the admiration of the whole world besides. Dear little Violet, I will choose you. Ah, never, never may I lose your magic power. Now the Queen could by her fairy art read all the thoughts which passed through Amabel's mind, and giving her the violet, she also gathered a rose, which, unperceived by the overjoyed little maiden, she gently waved over her, and at that moment she became one of the most beautiful little creatures on the face of the earth. But she was quite unconscious of this change in her appearance, and the mild and gentle modesty of her countenance remained unaltered, and formed one of its greatest charms. The little fairy sprites, who had been fluttering hither and thither in a restless manner for some time, not daring to interrupt the royal conference, now began to sing, "Royal mistress, haste away, ere the coming of the day, see the sun begins to rise, tinging all the eastern skies. Rest we safe in crystal grot, where the day beams scorch us not, till the moon, so clear and bright, comes to tell us it is night." And in less time than it takes to tell you, Amabel found herself lying in her own little bed, with her precious violet clasped closely to her bosom. The following morning, everyone who approached Amabel was astonished by her extraordinary beauty, which they were surprised to think that they had never before remarked. And as for her father and mother, they overwhelmed her with kisses and caresses. "How gentle, kind, and forgiving is our darling Amabel," said they. "Ah, that we had sooner learned to prize her as she deserves." Even little Marian clung with greater fondness than ever to her sister, and thanks to her violet, the little maiden was for the future as valued and beloved as she had formerly been neglected. But the fairies visited her nevermore, though often, when the sun was shedding his parting beams over the earth, she fancied she could discern in mid-air the golden turrets of the palace, where she had once feasted with the fairy queen, and hear the song the fairies had sung when she left them. "Sweet little darling Amabel, we bid you now a last farewell. Nevermore, dear, will you stand in golden halls of fairyland, or midst its radiant bowers, bend to gather sweetest flowers. But thou hast a fairy spell, that will serve thee long and well. Self-denial gave thee power to take from us at midnight hour the charm that wins the gift of love, a gift all other boons above. Mayst thou that power securely keep. Adieu, sweet child, blessed be thy sleep.